Welcome to Episode 10 of Ship of the Week. The Pacific theater of the Second World War abounded with events that changed the course of history, and the Imperial Japanese Navy fleet carrier Akagi was present for many of them. But before we get to the Second World War and Akagi's role in it, we must begin with the international community's response to the First World War. In February of 1922, France, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States met in the city of Washington to sign an agreement preventing a naval arms race of the scale that precipitated the Great War. The Washington Naval Treaty, as it is known, limited the number and tonnage of warships the signatories could build. Capital ships were decommissioned, projects already under construction were halted, and unfinished hulls were scrapped. The Imperial Japanese Navy already had 4 Amagi-class battlecruisers ordered, and 2 hulls, including what would become Akagi, were partially completed. The treaty did make provisions for the conversion of surface combatants into carriers, so the unfinished Akagi became an aircraft carrier. Launched at the Kure Naval Arsenal in 1925, Akagi was 855 feet long, and in her original configuration, displaced over 36,000 tons. Her sister Amagi was so heavily damaged by an earthquake during construction that she was never finished, and Akagi commissioned as a class of 1. Akagi's flight deck layout, as it appeared when she entered service, was unique to her and another Japanese carrier, Kaga, in that 3 flight decks could operate simultaneously, stacked atop one another like the layers of a wedding cake. The configuration was somewhat impractical for the more substantial aircraft in development by that point, however, as the lower flight decks were too short to accommodate larger planes. Early in her career, she wasn't fitted with a conventional carrier island superstructure either. Her bridge was tucked out of sight beneath the flight deck. Like many early carriers, Akagi also carried gun turrets of the type fitted aboard cruisers, although heavy guns would prove less useful on fleet carriers during the coming war. She was also fitted with 6 120mm anti-aircraft weapons platforms that, in contrast, would prove absolutely vital. In 1927, Akagi joined the 1st Carrier Division, and for nearly a year, between December of 1928 and November of 1929, she was under the command of then Captain Isoroku Yamamoto. In November of 1935, Akagi was removed from active service to undergo a vast modernization program. Her flight deck arrangement was reduced to a single flush deck configuration, with hangars beneath it, increasing her aircraft capacity by more than 40% to 84. Her heavy guns were replaced with 20mm gun positions, and she was also given an island above the flight deck. Her bridge and flight operations were moved there. Re-entering active service in December of 1938, she participated in operations against the Chinese mainland, and in the process, the Japanese Navy began using its carriers as large strike groups of multiple ships, a relatively new concept that would play an integral role in events to come. Throughout 1941, increasingly grim negotiations between Tokyo and Washington concerning Japanese actions in the Pacific and their access to American oil stores presented Japan with a crossroads. It determined a decisive preemptive strike following an official declaration of war was necessary. Akagi joined Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and a fleet of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support ships, departing the Kuril Islands on the 26th of November 1941 for Hawaii. There lay the Pacific Fleet of the United States. The strike force was under the command of Chuichi Nagumo, and Akagi was his flagship. By this point, the Japanese maintained some of the finest air crews and carrier operations techniques in the world. Shown here are the aircraft mechanics assigned to Akagi, taken earlier in 1941. Early in the morning on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, 230 miles north of Oahu, the first wave of torpedo bombers started their engines, followed not long thereafter by the second wave of Mitsubishi Zero fighter aircraft. seen here in operations that morning. Tora Tora Tora. Complete surprise. Shown here from an attacking aircraft, the battleship West Virginia is struck by a torpedo with the silhouettes of various Japanese bombers scattered throughout the scene. The attack came, through a delay in transcription, about an hour prior to Japan's final termination of peace negotiations. Two of the largest navies ever assembled were at war. In February of 1942, Akagi supported airstrikes on the Australian port city of Darwin, and throughout early 1942 her air group caused chaos, helping to sink the British cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire and carrier Hermes, as well as various merchant ships. Akagi and her carrier division failed to find the American carriers Hornet and Enterprise following the Doolittle raid on the Japanese mainland, however, and as a result, Admiral Yamamoto knew that with the American carriers continuing to operate in the Pacific, that his strategic goals were next to impossible, so he sought to destroy them, drawing them to a concentrated point by invading the Midway Islands. The Japanese strike force that sailed from Midway included Akagi, Hiryu, Soryu, and Kaga. There, armed with decoded messages announcing the operation, the American strike groups waited, just out of sight. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, U.S. Navy and Army Avenger and Marauder aircraft essentially fell out of the sky on the startled Japanese fleet, which promptly unleashed a hail of anti-aircraft fire. The Marauder attacks on Akagi were largely unsuccessful, and multiple aircraft were downed, including one that, either deliberately or due to inoperable controls, narrowly avoided tearing directly into Akagi's bridge before tumbling into the sea. Perhaps in retaliation for nearly dying, Nagumo ordered his aircraft armed with bombs for a second raid on Midway. While another raid by American Dauntless aircraft was also less than successful against the Japanese carriers, the following events proved much more catastrophic for Nagumo. A large group of American dive bombers scored hits on Kaga, and a group of them, under Commander Richard Best, seen in the center of the front row here, decided, mid-dive, to divert toward Akagi. Two bombs missed the carrier, but Best's ordnance plunged through Akagi's flight deck into the hangars below. The explosion destroyed her dive bombers preparing for a run on the American fleet, and Akagi was now burning furiously. Some of her fire suppression systems failed, and eventually so did her steering gear. Nagumo fled the dying ship to the battlecruiser Nagara, and in the very early hours of June 5th, with fire still burning throughout the ship, Admiral Yamamoto ordered his destroyers to fire torpedoes into Akagi to finally scuttle the ship. She sank at 5:20 a.m. by the head, with a loss of 267 of her crew.